I have indeed just been traveling around America on what's known as a book tour. I gave 12 talks in 12 cities over 14 days. Wow, I like that. The biggest challenge before I left on my book tour was, of course, deciding what I was going to pack on the book tour, what I was going to wear in front of all these audiences. I kept trying on different outfits for my husband, and each time he'd say, like, why are you trying to dress like a first-year associate at a law firm? Just wear your normal clothes, he said. Dress like yourself. My mom works in the fashion business, so I consulted her as well. And she said, I want to wear something that's appropriate in front of each audience. And she said, don't you get it? These are your events. Whatever you wear will be appropriate by definition. You set the tone. So to my credit, I did realize that this fashion problem was kind of a metaphor for the book that I was trying to pitch. Because the book is about how from age 40 onward, there are really no more grown-ups telling you what to do. You call the shots. At this stage of life, you're supposed to finally also become who you are and dress like who you are. So I'll just start with a few highlights from my sort of de Tocquevillian journey around the United States, just kind of reports from the field. First of all, in America, they no longer say anything is horrible. They now say it's horrible with a hard CH. I don't know if anyone else has noticed this. I don't know why this happened. Maybe it's just a lot of horror happening in America now. I was told that gratitude is the new grit in America now. Bilingual, I have actually known this for a while, is definitely the new gifted with children. A woman I met in San Francisco had told me she had enrolled her child in a Mandarin Immersion Reggio Emilia school, something I'm sure they don't have in China anywhere. Rich parents in America are creating a super race of multilingual children. All I can say to the rest of us is watch out. I quickly realized as my book tour began that it didn't matter at all what I was wearing. I was in sheer marketing mode. At one point in one city, I had a couple of hours off and I went to the steam room of my hotel and I ended up pitching my book to a group of naked women who I couldn't even see. I was in the zone, the selling zone. For most of the book tour, I was pitching my book, selling my book. Fully dressed, standing in front of audiences at bookstores. One bookstore sent a warning to me before I appeared. It was like an emergency text. And they said I shouldn't reveal too much about what's in the book or people won't buy it afterward. That's what they'd found. And I thought, that's really nice, but what am I supposed to talk about? In another bookstore, they handed me a Sharpie and sent me into the toilet. And they said all the authors are supposed to write on the wall, send a message. And I was deep into the book tour at that point. I was exhausted, I was jet lagged, and I decided that I wanted to write that line from The Handmaid's Tale in Latin. It was like, you will survive this, you will, to any future authors who are in that bathroom. I thought on the book tour that I was going to be talking about American politics constantly, that was all anyone would want to talk about, kind of the president and the situation. I found that nobody wanted to talk about politics, and I don't know if that's because watching America from abroad, it seems like that's all that's happening, or because I was a bit of kind of light relief, a guilty pleasure, so they could stop thinking about it all the time. I did get quite a lot of experience giving talks, book talks. I promise, just as an aside, this is not going to be a talk about talks. I will get to the thing itself eventually. In about half the talks I gave, it was a kind of Q&A. I was in conversation with another author, and that person would ask me about my book. And in the other half of the talks, I was just kind of like now, standing up and talking to a quiet audience, trying to figure out what they were thinking. So I thought that tonight I would try something new. I hope you'll come along for the ride with me. That I would do a kind of self-interview. I would do a Q&A with myself, an auto-interview. I would ask myself questions that I was either asked on my book tour or that I thought I should have been asked. Does this sound okay? Are you guys game for this? Okay, I don't have that many questions, just so you don't get nervous. I have about 4 or 5 questions, though if I say something really interesting, I may want to ask myself a follow-up. Question number one. Actually, question number one I was not asked on my book tour, but it's based on something that my husband, who also writes books, was once asked, when he was interviewed about his new book on British radio by someone who not only had not read the book, which, okay, I understand that, but didn't know the title of the book or what it was about or anything about it. And he said the person said to, my husband's name is Simon, said to him, "Simon Cooper, you've written a book. Tell us about it." I thought it was like the best book question ever. So I wanted to ask myself, Pamela Druckerman, you've written a book, tell us. But I have actually read my book. That's the advantage of the self-interview. But one question that I was asked a lot was, what made you decide to write a book? I should probably say it in a British accent. What made you decide to write a book about being in your 40s? Sorry, I obviously can't do accents. All I know is John Oliver and my husband. I can answer the question, what made me want to write a book about being in my 40s? So the answer is that I have long been fascinated by age. And I remember when I turned 30, I was working at the Wall Street Journal, and I guess a lot of people were turning 30 then because there was this book about being in your 30s that I haven't tried to find again, kind of being circulated around the office. And I read it, and all I can remember from the book was that it kept repeating the fact that professional female volleyball players are almost all in their 30s. And that fact alone was somehow really comforting to me, even though I didn't play volleyball. But then when I turned 40, I found that there really was no book about that age. There was no book that could really kind of lay out what was in front of me, what this kind of in-between stage of life was. I found little bits and pieces. Victor Hugo called 40 the old age of youth. Louis C.K. calls 40 half dead. I don't know if we're allowed to quote him anymore, but I still really like him. I thought actually my daughter, who was 10 at the time, summed it up best when we were in one of those tiny fluorescent lit Parisian elevators, and she was staring up at me and she said, "Mommy, you're not old, but you're definitely not young." So I decided I was going to start observing my own age, my new age, and taking notes. And I noticed really quickly that the 40s were not about one big change, they were about lots of little shifts. And so I would note these down when I kind of would realize them in the shower, or, well, very often in the shower actually, but also kind of wandering the streets of Paris. I realized at one point, oh my God, I have outgrown adult acne. Or I remember when someone younger than me was nominated to the US Supreme Court, I thought, I am never again going to be a prodigy at anything. I was at dinner one night with a group of friends, and I suddenly looked around the table and I thought, everyone at this table has a sport that their doctor tells them they're no longer allowed to play. Like, that says to be what the 40s were. And also with political developments happening. You know, I used to think, like, someone should really do something about that. And then I realized in my 40s, like, ooh, I'm the someone. I'm the one who's supposed to do something. The other real kind of atmospheric shift about moving into the 40s was that, you know, when you're younger, there are all these milestones that you're going through all the time, and you might not think about, but you're getting your driver's license, and you're graduating, and you're getting a job, and maybe you're getting maybe you have a baby or whatever. You're getting promotion, and you're just doing things that make you feel like you're progressing through the world, and there are all these people kind of cheering you on, and they're happy for you, and they're telling you that you're doing a good job. They're your parents, they're your mentors, and then you reach your 40s. And those people are kind of less interested in you and what you're doing. You know, they're going to doctor's appointments and thinking about their own issues. And there's this whole generation of people younger than you who now expect you to be cheering them on. In the book I say, I read the audiobook of this book, which was an interesting experience. And one of the most striking things about reading the audiobook was realizing that for someone who does not speak German, I had a lot of German words in my book for some reason that I could not pronounce. But I say in the audiobook in the book that the 40s is like entering I'm going to say this very badly, the Ding en sich, the thing itself. It's as if the future has arrived that you've been preparing for all these years. So if I had to sort of sum up what the book is in short, it's a kind of investigation of modern midlife. Even though 40 isn't even middle-aged anymore, someone who's now 40 has a 50% chance of living to age 95. We don't know even what to call it. There's not a good name for it. When I was on my book tour, I would often have these pre-interviews with producers, and this young woman called me, I think from Cincinnati, And I said, well, what do you think we're going to be talking about? And she said, well, we'll talk about people like you who are, and she was kind of like looking for the politically correct word to call it, and she said, who are like middle adults. And I was like, what is this, like J.R. Tolkien? Like, if we're in The Hobbit? Is this? But anyway, so the book really is an attempt to answer this question, what is this new stage of life, and what is it like to be in it? Okay, question number 2, which will be shorter than, marginally shorter than question number 1. So Pamela, you've talked about the downsides of being in your 40s. What are the upsides? Okay, my answer is, I haven't actually mentioned all the downsides yet. In the 40s, you can no longer wing it on coffee and 6 hours sleep. You need 8 hours in order to function. You sometimes wake up feeling hungover, even though you've had nothing to drink. In America, you're now old enough to be the victim of age discrimination. There are also neurological declines that I don't want to leave out. The ability to remember names peaks on average in your early 20s. People in their 40s are more easily distracted than younger people. We digest information more slowly, and we're worse at remembering any specific facts, not just names. But it turns out, because I did a lot of research for this book, that there is no point in the lifespan when all your abilities are peaking. There are various peaks for various abilities throughout the life course. So there are things that are peaking or we've improved at in our 40s. We're better, studies show, at resolving conflicts, at controlling our emotions. We're more considerate than younger people. We crucially have more of what the researchers call crystallized intelligence, which means things like the ability to draw conclusions, to make judgments based on our experiences, and to apply our knowledge to new situations. We're better than younger people at grasping the gist, the essence of situations, and explaining why things happen. Apparently our vocabularies are supposed to be better from the 40s onward, but I don't know if it's because I live in a foreign language that this has not happened to me. I think it sort of balances out. I think the crucial improvement at this age is that we understand other people better. We're more perceptive. I actually describe in the book the 40s as a journey from everyone hates me to they don't actually care that much about me. There's this wonderful test that was initially developed for people with autism to detect what their level of autism is. It's called reading the mind in the eyes, and you show people a kind of rectangular picture of someone's eyes, and you have to guess what emotion that person is feeling at that moment. And people in their 40s and 50s score higher than people in any other age group on this test. Basically, in the 40s, and this is what other studies show, is that you're less neurotic. You have less worry in your head about what other people are thinking of you, and you can take in more information about them. It's almost as if you become a psychic. You suddenly sort of know what's going on. I don't know if any of you, probably like me, you have trouble making it home if you live in Paris to your high school and college reunions. But I noticed that in my 20s and 30s at the reunions, people were really quite competitive. They're worried about their own status. They weren't that friendly. By your 40s, everybody just wants to have a good time. And I think really being able to socialize well and enjoy other people is one of the great pleasures of the 40s. I'm going to skip question 3, which is about the midlife crisis. If anyone's interested in that, we can talk about it in the Q&A period. Question number 4. Actually, nobody asked me this, but I think it's a really good question. I understand that this book began as a newspaper column. Can you tell us about this? Sure, I'd be happy to. So in 2013, I started writing a monthly column for a newspaper, for the New York Times. And I would always peg the column to important news events, things of international significance. They're very important. I would be fact-checked. And then one month, I didn't have a column. There was kind of nothing happening in France. But my own birthday was approaching, and I thought, well, what if I pegged a column to my own birthday? Could I do that? And instead of kind of reporting and interviewing people, I just made a list of all the things that I knew at that moment in time, the things that I kind of think about all the time, but that I didn't really include in my writing and my work. And I thought, no, you're not allowed to do this. I'm not allowed to do this. And if I do it, everyone will now know how old I am. But I steeled myself and I wrote the column. It was called What You Know in Your 40s. And I remember I was fact-checked on this column at one point because I had written that in your 40s you realize that you're 95% like other people and only 5% unique. And I meant this kind of like spiritually in the way you are, it wasn't like a biological assessment. And the fact checker called me and wanted to know, did I have sourcing for this? Where did I get my information? So I had to insert, this, to the credit of the New York Times, in my opinion, we're 95% like other people. But this column ended up being, this isn't saying very much, but the most widely read article I'd ever written, relatively speaking. I had taken this risk. I'd emptied my brain onto the page and exposed myself, and it worked. It resonated with people. I got letters from hundreds of people, not just in America, but around the world, saying that they felt similarly to the way I did on all kinds of topics. And I thought, oh my God, this is like the ultimate fact check. Like, I really am 95% like other people. I felt validated not just as a writer, but really as a human being who had been a bit introverted and awkward about things until then. Literally a week after this column ran, I was offered a book contract to convert my 1,000-word column into a 65,000-word book. To my credit, I consulted a psychic about whether or not to sign the contract. I phoned her up and she said, I was on the phone, but I could just sense her closing her eyes. And she said, I feel this book just flowing out of you. So I said, fantastic. I signed the contract. And then I was like, ooh, where do I find the other 64,000 words? The column had been a list basically just of bullet points. So one of them was, when you meet someone extremely charming, be cautious instead of dazzled. By your 40s, you've gotten better at spotting narcissists before they ruin your life. You know that nice isn't a sufficient quality for friendship, but it's a necessary one. So this was all nice, but a book isn't a list, it's a story. It needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. So what was going to be my story in this book? I was doing loads of research. I was looking at the psychology, the neuroscience, all the studies that have been done into midlife. But then every once in a while, something really funny would happen in real life, and I would write it down. So I suddenly couldn't hear anything that my husband was saying to me, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going deaf. And so I went to, this is in Paris, I went to an ear doctor, and he tested my ears, and then he said, Pamela, how old are your ears? And he said, basically, I guess this has happened to someone else here. He said, you have 42-year-old ears, and that's why it turns out I'd lost exactly the tones that my husband speaks in, unfortunately, which, believe it or not, has been like fantastic for our marriage. But eventually I realized that all these stories that I had been sort of scribbling down on the side were actually the book. And the mountains of research and studies that I had been reading were going to be sort of extras that I sprinkled into the text. And once I understood this, and trusted it, and really trusted again that I was like other people, the book, I won't say it ever really flowed out of me. I've fired my psychic, but it did actually get written, and became the book that's here today. Okay, the last question, which I was actually asked on the book tour in my defense. Although your book is a journalistic investigation of the 40s, it's also very personal. How did your family respond to being written about? It's a very good question. I had heard horror stories about people writing a memoir and then sending it to their family members, and their family members kind of lawyering up and saying, like, this never happened. I don't remember any of this. We were not in St. Louis in the summer of 1977. I had the opposite experience, which was wonderful, which is I sent the chapter I wrote about my growing up in Miami to my brother, and he wrote back to me, he said, that's exactly what happened. I was there. So that was fantastic. I did write about my parents' marriage, and I did a kind of excavation of the differences between them and what had happened. And my father read it, and his response was very moving. He said he hadn't understood what had happened until he read kind of my version of it, and it really helped him to understand something that he had had trouble kind of dissecting and decoding until then. My mother was slightly less appreciative of my version of events. She asked me for certain changes, a kind of deepening of her character, which I thought was actually a good note, and I did it. But to her credit, when I went to Miami to do a reading of the book at Books and Books in Miami, she introduced me. She stood in front of the crowd and she said, "I'm very proud of Pamela. I hope you'll read her book. Just don't read chapter 1. I spoke during this book tour. I was in Maplewood, New Jersey. Anybody here from Maplewood? Yes. Really? There's a book festival in Maplewood, New Jersey.
That's where I grew up.
Oh, that's so funny. I was channeling a comedian that I'd seen on TV when I asked that. So someone on the panel, it was a panelist of 4 women who'd written memoirs. They were all very solemn and sad. It made mine seem extremely cheerful. But one of them said, she quoted some memoirist who said, like, whatever happens to you, even if there are other people involved, you own it. It's your story. You have the right to tell it. And I thought, no, that's not true. Like, other people own their stories too. But I thought, but as a writer, you tell the story anyway. You transgress because you feel like you have to tell it. My strategy basically in telling other people's stories, not just my immediate family members, but kind of other relatives that I write about, was to soften the blow as much as I could. I think it was Evelyn Waugh who said, you can say whatever you want about a man as long as you add that he's attractive to women. So whenever I wrote about any of my, you'll find when you read the book, that all my relatives are described as being extremely attractive people. This is not always the case in real life. Anyway, I hope I haven't revealed too much about the book and that you'll still be tempted to read it. I thought I would end the solo section of the reading by reading a little bit from the conclusion of the book. The book is a lot about how, as I talked about earlier, how you reach a certain age and people treat you like a grown-up, or in France they start calling you madame. And you're sort of like, who are you talking to? And aren't there other grown-ups who are supposed to be in charge? And aren't there these mysteriously smart, capable people who can sort of like fly airplanes and get aerosol into bottles and make the world happen and be in charge? And in the end of the book, I kind of adjust my definition, conveniently perhaps, of what a grown-up is so that I can maybe feel like one myself. This is a quite serious part of the book. So I've realized that, like me, hardly anyone figures out a decade while they're still in it. There's always going to be a lag. But having now traversed most of the 40s, I think I know what it means to be a grown-up. It's to be yourself with other people. It's to keep them at the distance you choose. It's to care for others. It's to love them for their flaws. It's to be good at something. It's to transmit what you value and you know. It's to be honest. It's to be odd. It's to grasp what's happening and name it. It's to know your blind spots. It's to be a little bit wise. It's to merge your aspirational and your actual selves. It's to find your tribe. It's to decide for yourself what matters. It's to stop thinking that grown-ups are coming to explain everything and rescue you. It's to wing it, and it's to step up to the plate. There are stages of becoming a grown-up. First, you definitely aren't one. Then you pretend to be one. Then you're sure there are no grown-ups, that they're mythological and don't really exist. And then finally, maybe one day in your 40s, you just are one. This doesn't feel anything like you'd imagined. It's not all-knowing, omnipotent, and large. It's humble, solid, and small. But at long last, it feels like you, and you think just then that this is the best age of all. Now you can compliment my dress.
Beautiful dress.
If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we can all have a drink. Yes, Aurélie. Yes, I do write several chapters about sexuality. I write about, I don't know if this is appropriate to discuss at the American Library. Yes. Grant's like, go there, go there. For my husband's 40th birthday, I had these big plans to get him a watch, and I suggested this to him, and he said, "That's actually not what I want for my 40th birthday, thank you very much." And I really don't know if I can go through with talking about this. He said what he really wanted is what every heterosexual man who's ever like had more than 2 drinks has confessed that he wanted, which is a threesome with me and another woman. And so I write. So this happened to sort of mark the decade, and I decided to go through with it, or at least try to go through with it. And then midway through, really what I write about is the search for the other woman, and how it turns me into kind of like the hunter instead of the hunted, and what like a liberating experience that was. And I suddenly felt like I can just decide what I want and go after it. Like I don't have to sit back and wait for someone to pick me. But in the middle of this hunt, I got a call from a magazine editor who I knew in New York saying she was looking for personal essays, and I mentioned that I was doing this 40th birthday present. It hadn't quite happened yet and whatever, and like in no time, like in my email inbox was a contract for a magazine article that was titled 40th Birthday Threesome. So I thought, oh my God, I'm now kind of like contractually obliged to go through with this. I would have done it anyway in my defense as a moral being. But anyway, so I write about that experience in the book, and I actually write, this might interest you as a Franco-American, about the differences between sexuality among women over 40 in France and America. Because in America we have this story that, I remember when I turned 45, this friend of mine said to me, "Do you feel like you have 5 years before nobody ever wants to sleep with you ever again?" And which was kind of obnoxious, but I said yes. Like I actually do feel like I'm looking at my watch waiting for, and obviously youthful beauty is valued in France as well, but if you look at the sexual behavior statistics, like really good, solid national samples of people, among American women, sexual behavior from the 50s drops precipitously. It's like you do kind of fall off a cliff. Whereas in France, there is a decline from the 50s into the 60s, but it's much more gentle decline. And then I looked at the scientific research on this topic, and it turns out that people are ruled very much by the cultural story that they believe and that they're told. And when you're told that, as people are in France, that sex is just something that all healthy adults do throughout their lives, and you don't have to be kind of young and firm in order to merit it, that you keep having sex for much longer. And so, but when you're told the opposite, that you're kind of like you have 45 minutes left until then your behavior changes as a result of that. So I found that fascinating, just as an American, to kind of, not that you can just push a button and change stories, but knowing that you're being told a cultural tale instead of a kind of biological inevitability, I think at least takes some of the power away from it. I assumed that I was going to be writing a lot about the midlife crisis, that everyone had them, but it turns out that this too is a kind of cultural, people do have them, but it really, the idea of the midlife crisis was born in the late 1960s and late 1970s, when there were all these stories about transformation. There was a civil rights movement, there was a women's movement. People suddenly had this idea that if you didn't like your life, you could change it, you could transform reality. And so the midlife crisis was this very appealing idea suddenly. And it jumped from a very obscure academic paper. This Canadian psychoanalyst had kind of invented the term midlife crisis, and it jumped into popular culture. And by the 1970s, you had, probably all of you have seen Gail Sheedy's book Passages, which came out in 1976 and was #1 New York Times bestseller for over a year. And it kind of became a fact of life. There was like a midlife crisis board game, and it was on mugs and bumper stickers. Like people were saying you have to have one, that it's biologically inevitable. And then in about the late 1980s, 1990s, scientists said, well, let's test this. There's suddenly money, funding for research on midlife. And it turned out that very few people actually had an event that could qualify as a midlife crisis. It's something like 10 to 20% of people. And among those people are a big category of people that the psychologists call crisis-prone individuals who just like have crises throughout their lives. So they happen to have one at 39 as well. So let's call it a midlife crisis. So, which is not to like undermine the severity of the event when it happens, but it kind of became a story that shapes people's lives. So you can be like very proud of yourself if you manage to like get through your 40s without having a midlife crisis. You somehow dodged a bullet. And if you do have a crisis, you could say, well, this is just perfectly normal. Everyone has one of these. I'm having one too. It was an idea that was sort of could not be debunked. That was the problem with the midlife crisis. I think in part because it just had this great name. Like it was like the terrible twos. Like most 2-year-olds are actually quite fine, but you know, there's the power of the phrase that won't kind of go away. At the same time that I've been just completely obsessed with age while I was writing this book, I found that I now have friends of all ages. You know, I have friends in their 80s now, and I don't really see a difference. I don't necessarily look to them as like truth tellers about the future, but yeah, I find that I care less, and I have younger friends, and I'm less kind of age focused, even as I am completely age obsessed. It's an interesting paradox. I would say the fact that I started to look like I was in my 40s. I somehow thought, because that had been like, that had always been my superpower. Like I looked young. Even when I was in my 30s, I got carded in bars and you know, and then suddenly, and especially in France, you cannot escape this at all. Like it's 1 week you're mademoiselle, then you're kind of like, ironically, madame, like with a little wink, and then you're just full on madam. And it happens to everyone at the same time. And it's like, what, did you have a vote the night before? Like, is there a slideshow that goes on that I don't know about? So yeah, I didn't think it would happen to me. I thought I would have to somehow consent to this process. And it turns out, yeah, everybody knows how to do it. Let that be a warning to you. Yeah, there ended up being, it wasn't my initial plan, but there ended up being a lot about France in this book too, in terms of, well, I talked about sexuality and sexual behavior, but also in terms of dealing with beauty and issues of beauty as you get older. I think I kind of concluded that the American story is try to stay as young looking as you can for as long as you can. Like that is the struggle, that's the objective. And then when that stops working, as it inevitably does, you kind of blame yourself, first of all, because you failed in battle. And also there's this line, this is a story where you say, you know, I've given up, or I don't care what anyone thinks anymore. It's like wonderful to reach this time of life where I no longer care what anyone thinks, which I think is a lie, first of all, and also a little bit sad. Like, why, we're social creatures. Why would you want to reach a point where you actually don't care about other minds and you don't care about connecting with them? Obviously, there could be a point of too much caring, but not caring at all, it just seemed not a wonderful objective to have, or a realistic one. And so the French story that I kept hearing from women I interviewed here, which again is not necessarily what everybody actually thinks, but it's this kind of story that's in the air about what you should think, is that you should try to look like the best version of the age that you are. Which is just a small adjustment, but it's very calming because it means you can be in your body in a way. Because another part of the American story was like, well, I'm 74, but I really feel like I'm 35 inside. And what you see is not the real me. There's this kind of disconnect. And the sociologists find this in the studies, that lots of women feel like and men too, feel like their exterior doesn't represent who they really are, which creates a lot of stress and tension. So, I did hear that a little bit in France too, but this story about how, you should look like the best version of the age that you are, and there's also this kind of pragmatic story, which is trying to look young is the fastest way to look old. That's what women here told me all the time, which I think is true, partly because of the stress and the tension of it, the failure of it. You kind of walk around looking terrified about what people are thinking of you. But there's a lot more about France in the book too, if that interests you. I basically just handed them my book and said, read it, but don't read the chapter on like my husband's 40th birthday present. Yeah, I haven't really gone. I've been busy writing. I haven't really spoken to them in a while. I know I had a thought of something I should do. I do want to know what to do. I mean, I'm very, as I'm sure we all are, consumed by this current political moment and saddened by it and looking for something constructive and healing and fruitful and effective to do about it. I actually pitched a column today, not to the New York Times, but to another publication, on eye shades, on like women and their relationship with their eye shades. And I thought, I sent in this pitch and I thought, oh my God, what is the matter with me? Like the universe is ending and I want to write an article. No one here is allowed to write the eye shades article. If there are any journalists in the audience, it is mine. I own eye shades. If you want to give me quotes, I'll take the quotes. But I was like, maybe I should just quit writing. I mean, maybe I should start writing this kind of stuff and just write something that matters. But how can I reach anyone that doesn't already like 150% agree with me? I mean, I don't know how to have a conversation with somebody who, I don't know how to have a conversation with the other side. I honestly don't know how to do it, and I mean, it's one of the things I want to figure out. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how to, I'll, if I think of it, I had this idea in the middle of the night last night about how to do it, but then I should have written it down. Damn. Do you have thoughts on that? Yeah, I mean, it is the problem. Yeah. I wrote a chapter in the book about wisdom and what wisdom is, and I was thinking that if I just published that chapter, people would read it and go, oh my God, the president is not wise. Like, he doesn't meet any of these 50 criteria for wisdom. People would be blown, but, sadly, that has not happened yet. Stay abroad? I mean, you're serious about how to be politically effective?
No, not at all.
Oh.
Whatever you take out of that question.
Oh. I don't know, don't eat too many croissants? Or Finally, an audience that wants to talk about politics. I feel like I don't want to share every crisis that passes through. I haven't told them about these children who are being separated from their families at the border, because I just don't even know how to explain it. And I also don't want to feel like I'm brainwashing them in some way. Like sometimes they have all the conviction of disliking the administration without any of the facts, and I feel like I've just fed them some kind of liberal religion, and I want them to decide for themselves based on the facts, but I don't want to share too many of the facts with them. So I don't know, I don't know, delicately, gently. My kids read the children's French newspaper, and there's a lot of information. I'm surprised by what they know just from reading the Petit Quotidien and Mon Quotidien on this. Yeah. Maybe one more question, Jeff, do you think that's good pace?
If there are no more questions, I'm going to be back out to the voter registration and ballot request thing, and that is what Americans can do when they live abroad?
Sorry, yes. Americans can vote. You're right. Thank you for saying that. I'm not afraid to ask myself anything, Jeff. What are you afraid to ask yourself?
You're up there, I'm down.
No, I one thing that I should add, just on the topic of the midlife crisis, is that I didn't find lots of people having a classic midlife crisis, but I did find that in the 40s, a lot of people have a kind of reckoning where they do ask themselves hard questions like, am I really ever going to write that novel? Or am I truly heterosexual, or these kind of big life questions. And I've seen people's lives really pivot around answering those questions, these big, deep questions, because it's this era of, this is real life, it's now or never. I think people feel like it's really pointless to keep pretending to be what they're not at this age, and they start kind of embracing, mostly very happily I've seen, who they really are. So, sorry, I didn't mean to dodge your bullet of a question, but
That was a great answer.
thank you. Thank you all so much for coming.